It was the autumn of 2009 when Grace Pellerin realized, with the particular clarity that only comes from reading a single sheet of paper, that someone had decided her family's maple farm was standing in the way of their future. The letter came tucked between a hydro bill and a seed catalog. It was printed on heavy cream stock, the kind that costs more per sheet than she made in an hour tapping lines, and it smelled faintly of something synthetic, like new carpet in a building that had never once let in fresh air. It announced, in the cheerful, bloodless language of corporate development, that Northgate Resorts and Hospitality was pleased to share news of an exciting new project, a 4-season luxury retreat to be called the Ridgeline at Crestfall Lake, breaking ground the following spring on 600 acres of Crown land and private holdings adjacent to the eastern boundary of Pellerin Family Farm, Lanark County, Ontario. The letter used the word adjacent 3 times. Grace noticed that. Adjacent. Like a word that wanted to sound harmless by standing close enough to touch. Let me tell you about the farm first, because you need to understand what was at stake before you can understand what she did. The Pellerin property sat on 140 acres of the Frontenac Arch, that ancient ridge of Precambrian granite that cuts through eastern Ontario like the spine of something older than memory. The sugar bush alone covered 60 acres, a cathedral of hard maples that Grace's grandfather, Rémy Pellerin, had started tapping in 1951 when he was 22 years old and newly arrived from Abitibi with a used tractor and an absolute refusal to fail. He had not failed. He had instead built something that smelled like wood smoke and cold sap and the particular sweetness of a March thaw, something that people drove 40 minutes off the highway to find every spring, filling their cars with glass jugs and tins and leaving with the look on their faces of people that something real still existed in the world. Grace had inherited it 3 years before the letter arrived. When she was 26, after her grandfather passed in his armchair with his reading glasses on and a cup of tea gone cold beside him. It was a gentle death for a man who had earned one, but it left her alone with a wood-fired evaporator that needed a new arch, 60 acres of trees that needed their lines checked before every season, and a small retail cabin at the end of the lane where she sold syrup, maple butter, and taffy on snow-to-school groups who came in February and left sticky-fingered and loud and wonderful. The community around Crestfall Lake saw the resort announcement the way people who have been waiting for something see the thing they were waiting for. There were letters to the editor about jobs, about tourism dollars, about the region, finally getting the recognition it deserved. At the feed store in Perth, Grace overheard 2 men she had known her whole life talking about property values. One of them, Gord Arsenault, who had watched her grandfather plant 100 trees in a single afternoon, turned and saw her standing with a bag of layer pellets and said, not unkindly, "You know what they're offering, Grace? For that east section alone, you could pay off everything and still have enough to set yourself up somewhere nice. Barhaven, maybe, or closer to Ottawa." She thanked him. She paid for the pellets. She drove home. The man from Northgate arrived 6 weeks later. His name was Mr. Douglas Thorne, and he was everything the letter had been. Smooth, expensive, and faintly synthetic. He drove a black SUV that still had the rental sticker on the windshield, which told her he had flown in from somewhere and considered this a day trip. He stood in her laneway in a jacket that was technically appropriate for October, but had clearly never been worn in actual October, looking at the sugar house with the expression of a man calculating the demolition cost. Grace met him where he stood. She did not invite him inside. "Mrs. Pellerin," he said, and his voice had that particular texture of someone who had been trained to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things. I appreciate you making time. I'll be direct. Northgate has significant interest in this property, specifically the eastern and northern parcels, the sugar bush, and he paused here with a small diplomatic wince, the processing infrastructure, her grandfather's sugar house with the hand-painted sign. The sugar one that said Pellerin 1951 was being called infrastructure. Our environmental consultants have flagged certain operational realities, Mr. Thorne continued. The resort will include a spa, private chalets, a waterfront lodge. Our guests will be seeking a premium wilderness experience. The agricultural activity, the equipment noise, the seasonal workers, the smoke from the evaporator creates a profile that isn't necessarily consistent with that positioning. He named a number. It was the kind of number that made your breath go short for a second. The kind that people in movies accept and then spend the rest of the movie trying to feel okay about. Grace looked at him for a moment. A raven landed on the peak of the sugar house roof behind him, looked around once with that sovereign indifference since ravens have, and left. The farm is not for sale, Mr. Thorne, she said. He smiled in the way people smile when they believe they are dealing with someone who does not yet understand what is about to happen to them. I understand this is an emotional decision. We're not asking for an answer today. I'd encourage you to speak with a financial advisor, perhaps a family member. The farm is not for sale, she said again. Drive safe. The road ices early past the second curve. She went back inside. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him turn the SUV around in the laneway. 3 awkward points because he had misjudged the width, and then she sat down at the table where her grandfather used to grade syrup by holding jars up to the window light, and she put her head in her hands for just a moment. Not from grief. From the particular exhaustion of having just drawn a line and knowing what would come next. She was right about what came next. Now, let me explain something about what the following 2 years felt like from the inside, because it is easy, from a distance, to make it sound noble. It was not always noble. It was often just hard. Construction began in May. The access road they cut through the Crown land to the north of her property ran close enough to her fence line that she could see the flagging tape from her kitchen window. The blasting came in July, short controlled detonations that cracked through the bedrock, and each one sent a shudder through the farmhouse that rattled the syrup jars on their shelves and made her old border collie, Fergus, press himself against her leg and shake. The maples, she worried most about the maples. They are not sentimental trees. They are, in fact, among the most sensitive trees in the northern forest to changes in soil compaction, water table disruption, and particulate matter. Her grandfather had known this, which was why he spent 30 years building a roadside windbreak of white spruce along the north boundary, a thick, uneven wall of trees he'd planted in staggered rows, not for aesthetics but for function, to protect the sugar bush from the road spray and the northwest winds that came hard off the shield in February. But the south and east boundaries were open. That was where the resort was coming from. That was where the dust came from, a fine gray beige silt that the heavy equipment stirred into the air, and that settled on everything, on the leaves of the understory plants, on the gravel by the sugar house, on the surface of the sap in the outdoor collection tank if she left it uncovered for an hour. She started finding it in the kitchen, in the window tracks, on Fergus's coat. The light was the other thing. The light meant the resort's site prep ran night crews through August, and the floodlights they erected along the eastern ridge were extraordinary, the kind of industrial luminosity that turned midnight into an approximate dusk. She started closing the curtains on the east side of the house, something she had never done in her life. Her grandfather had always said there was no better alarm clock than the birds and the light, and she had grown up with both. Now the light was wrong, an orange-tinged glow that bled through the curtains and made her bedroom feel like she was sleeping in a parking structure. She began to wonder about the trees. Hard maples need theirs. The temperature drop, the particular angle of October light that tells them to begin pulling sugars down from the leaves. She had no studies, no data. She had only the knowing that comes from watching the same 60 acres of trees for every year of your life and understanding them the way you understand a person you have lived with for a long time. They were not right. They were not themselves. It was in that first winter, January, black and bitter, and 38 below with the wind chill, that she found her grandfather's notebook. It was not a discovery exactly. She had known the notebook existed. It was a brown Hilroy coil-bound, the kind you buy at a drugstore, and it had lived in the middle drawer of the desk in what had been his office for as long as she could remember. She had simply never opened it because it had belonged to him, and the grief of those first years was still close enough that she had avoided touching certain things. She opened it that January because she was looking for an old hydro account number, and the desk drawer was the logical place to look. The account number was not there, but 30 years of thinking was. Her grandfather had written in a small, economical French-inflected hand, mixing English and Quebecois in the practical way of someone who had learned both languages as tools rather than ideas. The notebook contained records of tapping dates going back to 1963, of the years the sap had run early and the years it had sulked until April. It contained notes on individual trees, identifications by location, and a hand-drawn grid of the bush. Tree number 47, northeast quadrant, had been producing above average for 22 consecutive years. Tree number 12 had a canker that he'd been watching since 1971 and which had never progressed beyond one significant branch. And he had decided to simply leave it alone. And then, near the back, in a section that looked newer than the rest, dated 1987, there was a heading that said simply, "Pour le bruit et la lumière," for the noise and the light. In 1987, the provincial government had proposed a gravel extraction operation on the Crown land to the north. It had not proceeded, eventually, due to environmental objections, but her grandfather had spent a full autumn preparing for it, as if it would, and what he had prepared was a plan for a living screen, a multi-layered planting along the exposed boundaries that would address both the acoustic and the light intrusion problems at once. He had thought about it the way he thought about everything, systematically, patiently, with a specificity that made her feel, reading it in the cold of January with the wind hitting the north wall, that he was sitting across the desk from her. Fast-growing Manitoba maples for the first-year screen, he wrote. Not ideal trees, weedy. But they come up fast and buy time for the real planting behind them. Balsam fir for the mid-layer, dense and year-round, good noise absorption. Then, on the inside, a mixed hardwood screen of native species, ironwood, yellow birch, serviceberry. These take time, he wrote, maybe 20 years before they matter, but they will matter long after you and I are both gone, and that is the point. He had sketched a planting grid. He had estimated the number of trees. He had written the name of the nursery in Smith's Falls, where he had been quoted prices, and the name of the man he had spoken to there. Grace sat with the notebook for a long time. The wind outside had the particular quality of Canadian January, personal and relentless, and Fergus had climbed onto the old sofa where he was not supposed to be and pressed his chin onto her knee. She understood something, reading those pages. Her grandfather had not been protecting his farm from a specific threat. He had been protecting it from the general fact of the world is that the world will always send something. He had been planting for a threat that had never arrived, and he had left the plan in a drawer in a Hilroy notebook where she would find it when the threat finally came. She ordered 3,000 trees in February. Let me be honest about how this looked from the outside. It looked like exactly what her neighbor Helen Kowalski said. It looked like when she saw the first delivery arrive in March. "Grace, honey, those are sticks." They were sticks. Manitoba maple, whips barely as thick as a broomstick. Balsam fir seedlings in root-bound plugs that smelled of greenhouse and peat. She planted them alone, starting at the east boundary and working north, using a dibble bar she'd found in her grandfather's tool shed that he had probably last used in 1989. She dug each hole, dropped in a seedling, healed it in, moved on. Her hands blistered. The blisters opened and healed into calluses, and then the calluses cracked in the cold. She wore through 2 pairs of work gloves and bought a third. The people who saw her planting were kind about it, which is sometimes worse than not being kind. The kindness had in it the texture of watching someone do something hopeless. Gord Arsenault drove past one Saturday afternoon while she was working the north line and stopped his truck and leaned out the window and said, "You need help?" And she said she was fine, and he said, in a careful voice, "The resort's opening next spring, you know. That whole east side'll be lit up." She knew. She kept planting. The moment of doubt arrived in the 2nd April, which is the cruelest month for a maple farmer because it is the month that proves or disproves everything. And that year the season was wrong. A hard freeze came in mid-April after 2 weeks of warmth, and it killed the early run. She stood in the sugar bush at 7 in the morning and looked at taps that were producing a thin, watery trickle that would not be worth boiling, and across the ridge the resort was in its final stages of construction, gleaming and confident, its roof lines visible above the tree line in a way that made her feel the smallness of what she was doing with a physical force. She sat down on a deadfall. She had not planned to. Her legs simply made the decision without her. The doubt, when it came, was not dramatic. It was quiet and specific. It said, "You could have taken the money. You could be somewhere warm. You could be sleeping in a bedroom without orange light coming through the curtains. You could have let this go." She sat on that deadfall for a while. Fergus sat beside her, leaning against her leg, because he was a dog who understood the geometry of comfort. Then she looked at the trees she had planted. The Manitoba maples were, against all reasonable expectation, alive. They had taken hold in the rocky Frontenac soil with the stubborn opportunism that is the defining quality of Manitoba maples, which are, as her grandfather had accurately called them, weedy. They were not beautiful. They were barely a meter tall, and they looked like something you'd pull out of a fence line. But they were alive, and behind them the balsam firs were putting out new growth, the bright chartreuse of new needles visible even from a distance. She thought about the notebook. She thought about 1987, when her grandfather had been roughly the age she was now, sitting at that same desk planning for a threat that had not yet arrived. She got up. She had taps to check and sap to collect, and it was going to be a poor season, but it was going to be her season, and she had work to do. The ridgeline at Crestfall Lake opened in June of that year. It was, by every account, exactly what it had promised to be. 52 private chalets with heated floors and stone fireplaces. A spa built over a natural granite outcrop, with treatments that cost more than Grace made in a good weekend at the farm stand. A waterfront lodge with a menu that described itself as rooted in northern terroir, which, as best Grace could tell, meant Quebec duck confit and Prince Edward County wine and a mushroom risotto made with porcinis that had been driven up from the Toronto food terminal. The guests arrived. The parking lot filled on weekends with vehicles from Ottawa and Toronto and Montreal. the kind of cars that have been washed recently and have cargo space that has never actually held cargo. They were, from everything Grace could see, from her side of the ridge, perfectly happy people who had paid a great deal of money to be in a beautiful place and were being given a beautiful place in return. She had no argument with them. She had never had an argument with them. The wall, meanwhile, grew. This is the part that people who have never planted trees tend to underestimate. Trees grow, not immediately, not dramatically, not in the way of anything that rewards impatience. But they grow with a consistency that compounds the way interest compounds, the way any patient investment compounds. The Manitoba maples reach 2 meters, then 3, their canopies broadening, their root systems going deep into the granite seams in the way that only trees with nothing better to do have time to do. The balsam firs behind them were filling in their dense year-round foliage, doing exactly what her grandfather had predicted, absorbing sound, not eliminating it, but changing its character, the way heavy curtains change the quality of sound in a room. The hard machinery sounds from the resort grounds crew softened. The helicopter that ferried certain guests in on Friday evenings, she had taken note of that particular feature and stored it away, was still audible, but differently audible, a muffled thump rather than the cracking overhead intrusion it had been in the first year. In her 5th year of operation alongside the resort, Grace had a spring season that reminded her why she had stayed. The sap ran for 19 days, which is a long run, and it ran clean and cold, the best conditions for high-grade syrup. She worked the evaporator for 17-hour days, and the sugar house filled with steam that smelled of the particular concentrated sweetness that has no analog, that cannot be approximated or manufactured, that is entirely a product of these specific trees, on this specific piece of the shield, drawing sugars up from soil that has been building itself for 10,000 years. She bottled 200 liters that spring. She sold out by the end of May. The first Ridgeline guest appeared at her farm stand in June. He was a man in his early 60s, unhurried in the way of people who are paying enough per night to feel that their time belongs to them, and he bought a medium amber and a jar of maple butter and asked her 3 careful questions about the trees and the process that told her he actually wanted to know the answers. He came back the next day with his wife. He bought 2 more bottles. She did not think much of it at the time. The thing she did think about was a conversation she had at the Perth Farmers Market that August with a woman named Diane Marchetti, who ran the market and had known Grace since she was small. Diane told her, with the particular relish of someone delivering information that proves a point they've been holding, that the Ridgeline's dining room had been receiving requests, specific requests, from guests who had walked down to the Pellerin stand, asking whether the resort's kitchen used local maple syrup, whether that maple butter was available in the gift shop. The answer, Diane reported with satisfaction, had been no. The Ridgeline sourced its maple products from a regional distributor out of the Ottawa Valley, the same product you could find at any grocery between here and Sudbury, in the same format bottles with the same stock label. The guests, who had just spent a weekend paying for authenticity, were not impressed. The concierge, Diane had heard from a friend who had heard from another friend, had started keeping Grace's farm stand hours in a handwritten note by the front desk for guests who asked. 18 months after that conversation, a black SUV that was not quite the same as the first one, but close enough pulled into Grace's laneway. Mr. Douglas Thorne was not driving it. The man who stepped out was younger, dressed more casually, in the careful way of someone who has been coached to dress more casually, and his name was Mr. Ryan Kessler. He was, he explained, the new director of guest experience at the Ridgeline. He had taken over the previous autumn. Grace was restringing a section of tap line along the south edge of the bush. She kept working while he explained himself. "We've been doing a lot of listening to our guests," Mr. Kessler said. "There's a very consistent theme around local provenance, authenticity, the story behind the product." He paused. "Your name comes up?" "Often." She tied off the line and turned to look at him. He seemed like a person who meant what he said. "Which is it you're proposing?" she asked. He proposed a supply arrangement. "What is it?" "Maple syrup for the dining room, in a format they could brand on the menu. Maple butter for the gift shop." He mentioned a quantity. "That quantity," Grace said, "is more than I produce in a season. We could work with what you have. You could work with what I decide to provide," she said. "What I decide to provide won't change based on what you need. My trees produce what they produce. I'm not expanding the tap count beyond what's healthy for the stand." "That's the number." He nodded carefully. "I'll have my terms written up," she said. "My lawyer will send them over. You can have your people look at them and let me know." She did not expect the terms to be accepted without negotiation. This was a miscalculation on her part, because the terms were accepted with very little negotiation, which told her she had probably asked for too little. She filed that information away for the future. The terms as written were these. Grace would supply a fixed volume of maple syrup and maple butter per season, at a price she set, which was not a wholesale price. It was a retail price with a margin added for the inconvenience of dealing with a corporate entity. The ridgeline would credit Pellerin Family Farm, Crestfall Lake, on every menu item containing her product and would not describe any other maple product as local or artisanal. And there was one additional term, which her lawyer had drafted and which Grace had read 3 times before signing, because it gave her a satisfaction she did not want to show in her face. The Ridgeline's helicopter service would reroute its Friday evening arrival path away from the Pellerin property boundary, as the low-altitude flight was documented to cause stress to livestock and disrupt the sugar maple stand's light environment during sensitive seasonal periods. A deviation of 2 kilometers to the north would add 40 seconds to the flight and would be, the term stated dryly, an acceptable operational adjustment. Mr. Kessler's team had objected to this last point. There had been some discussion about Transport Canada airspace regulations and routing commitments and operational precedent. Grace had let her lawyer handle that conversation. She was not present for it. She had been in the bush at the time, checking her tap lines. The helicopter rerouted. Now, let me tell you what happened on the morning she signed the contract, because it is not a dramatic thing, and that is exactly why I want to tell you. She signed it at her kitchen table, with the same pen she used for everything, a blue Papermate she bought in a box of 12 from the Canadian Tire in Perth. She put the signed copies in a manila envelope. She made herself a coffee. She stood at the south window and looked at the sugar bush, which was in its October color, the maples burning amber and gold in the particular way of trees that have had a good season with the right amount of wet and cool, the kind of color that has no business being as beautiful as it is. She had not beaten anyone. She had not fought anyone. She had planted trees in soil that her grandfather had spent 60 years making worth planting in, and she had waited for the trees to grow, and she had held the line, and that was all. Fergus came and stood beside her. She scratched behind his ear without looking down. Outside, past the stand of Manitoba maples and the filling-in balsam firs, the ridgeline at Crestfall Lake was visible in pieces through the foliage, a roofline here, a window glint there. In a few more years, she estimated, it would not be visible at all. The trees were doing what trees do when you leave them to it. The season she turned 34, a young woman named Maya Okafor came to the farm for 3 days. She was 27 and had inherited her grandmother's blueberry operation in the Annapolis Valley 2 years before and was being pressured by a winery consortium to sell the south field that her grandmother had spent 40 years building into productive land. She had read about Grace somewhere online in a piece a CBC food journalist had written about the Ridgeline Partnership, and she had driven 12 hours to ask what Grace would have told herself at 27, standing in a laneway, listening to someone name a number. Grace walked the south boundary of the bush with her and showed her the planting. The Manitoba maples were tall now, real trees. Nothing like the sticks that had arrived on a flatbed in March 8 years ago. The firs behind them were shoulder to shoulder. Through them you could see very little of what was on the other side. The money they offered felt real, Maya said. The farm feels like a question. Grace nodded. She understood that feeling. She had sat with it on a deadfall in an April that was too cold and too quiet, with a dog leaning against her leg and nothing to show for 2 years of work but a row of sticks in granite soil. The farm is a question, she said, but it's your question to answer, not theirs. She stopped and put her hand on the nearest maple, one of the big ones her grandfather had tapped in 1964, its bark gray and furrowed and absolutely itself. They will always have a number, she said. That's their language. It's the only thing they know how to offer. Your job is to remember that a number is not an argument. It's just a number. Maya stayed 3 days. She helped with the morning line check on her last day, before the drive back to Nova Scotia. She was a quick learner, the kind of person who watches once and understands. Before she got in her car, she hugged Grace, which Grace was not expecting, and said, "I'm not selling the south field." Grace said, "Good." She watched the car turn out of the laneway and go east on the county road, and then she went back to work. The notebook was on the desk in the office now, out of the drawer. It had been there for 8 years. She had added to it, her own handwriting next to her grandfather's, filling in what the years had taught her, which trees had surprised her, which sections of the bush were responding to the new windbreak, what the tap counts looked like when the east boundary was protected versus when it wasn't. The data was useful, but that wasn't really why she kept it out. She kept it out because of what he had written at the bottom of the page about the living screen in 1987 for a threat that had not come. He had written it in his practical mixed language shorthand, but she had translated it once for herself, sitting at that same desk in that same January, and the translation had not left her. "Plant it anyway," he had written. "You won't always know what it's for. That doesn't matter. Plant it anyway. The land will find a use for it." She had found a use for it. The land had known all along.